few would have predicted Max Verstappen's remarkable climb from 17th on the grid to victory in the 2024 Formula One Brazilian Grand Prix, marking his first win since June's Spanish Grand Prix. Verstappen's performance was a masterclass in resilience, and his triumph highlighted his adaptability and control in tricky conditions. Following Max Verstappen's inspiring drive, Alpine celebrated an astonishing success, with Esteban Ocon and Pierre securing second and third places. The duo's performance delivered Alpine more points in a single race than they had managed to accumulate throughout the entire season so far. Their surprise success underscored the unpredictability of the race and brought a fresh, electric energy to the podium. In stark contrast, top teams like McLaren and Ferrari found themselves outpaced, struggling to adapt to the wet conditions. Lando Norris, still a strong championship contender, battled persistent front-locking issues, which hampered his ability to mount a serious challenge. Meanwhile, Ferrari's Charles Leclerc wrestled with the handling of his SF24, describing the experience as pretty horrendous and indicative of the car's struggles in inclement weather. Ultimately, while the top three enjoyed a day of celebration, the Brazilian Grand Prix served as a reminder of the sport's unpredictable nature, as some of the season's strongest teams found themselves unable to keep up with the surprising frontrunners. The Monegasque driver stated after the São Paulo race that they had simply not been fast enough. He described the car as extremely difficult to drive, noting that it was very pointy, digital, and oversteery. The strong results for Max Verstappen and the two Alpine drivers were certainly aided by the red flag, which allowed a convenient tire change. However, attributing their podium finishes to mere luck or a fortunate gamble would be unfair. Their speed and performance after the red flag restart demonstrated that their podium places were well-earned and a result of how their cars excelled in wet conditions. It's well established that some cars adapt better to rain than others, as multiple factors align to compensate for deficiencies typically exposed on a dry track. One clear advantage Alpine had was that wet conditions helped minimize one of its key weaknesses: engine power. Wet races demand careful throttle management, which levels the playing field and reduces the emphasis on outright power. However, a more intriguing aspect influencing performance differences in the wet lies in the aerodynamic effects of wet weather tires. Ground effect cars are highly sensitive to ride height. Downforce significantly increases as they get closer to the track surface. The intermediate tires, with a diameter about 5 mm larger than slicks, 725 mm compared to 720 mm, subtly shift the car's platform. This difference, while small, can noticeably alter downforce. It's also worth noting that Brazil's bumpy Interlagos circuit had already forced teams to raise their ride heights, meaning cars weren't operating in their ideal range. Switching to Inter's further raised ride height, likely worsening performance for cars already struggling to stay in their optimum window. Aside from ride height, tire sidewall stiffness plays an equally crucial role in wet weather performance. How a tire deforms under cornering forces and with added downforce impacts aerodynamics significantly. Teams carefully tune their setups in wind tunnels, using model tires designed to replicate sidewall deformation precisely. Any change in sidewall stiffness, even slight, can disrupt a car's aero balance, potentially making a stable car in the dry feel much twitchier in the wet. Haas team principal Ayao Komatsu noted that the shift to intermediate tires tends to upset his cars, a problem they've seen before. Earlier in the season at the circuit of Spa-Francorchamps, similar issues arose with Haas's car losing rear downforce when switching to rain tires, indicating a recurring struggle with the aerodynamic response to wet weather conditions. The Japanese motorsport executive and engineer explained that the adjustments required to remove aerodynamic balance clearly indicate a weakness in the rear of the car when using intermediate tires, which has been a new issue this season. He added that, since the car is designed in wind tunnels with tires intended for dry conditions, stability dropped significantly as soon as they first ran on intermediates or wet tires, although he couldn't recall the exact timing of that initial test. In contrast, Red Bull and Alpine appeared to have a clear advantage over their rivals in wet conditions. While teams are still exploring whether the aerodynamic effects of tire choice played a pivotal role in Brazil, an analysis of lap times hints at a shift in competitive dynamics. One notable aspect of the São Paulo Grand Prix weekend was that it featured both a dry sprint session and a rain-soaked race. giving a rare side-by-side view of how teams perform across vastly different conditions. Despite the fact that direct qualifying comparisons are somewhat limited, taking into consideration that not every car showed its full capabilities under identical conditions, they still reveal some shifting trends in the running order. In the rain, Alpine and Red Bull seemed to excel, while Ferrari notably fell back, underlining the differing performance profiles between dry and wet conditions. A more precise measure of each car's performance and the shifts in competitiveness from dry to wet conditions emerges through an analysis of race pace. By examining the quickest lap set by each team's lead car, focusing solely on clean racing laps to exclude distortions from pit stops and race restarts, a distinct trend becomes apparent. Red Bull and Mercedes notably improved their relative pace in the wet, pulling ahead of their competitors, while McLaren and Ferrari struggled to keep up. Ferrari, in particular, experienced one of the steepest declines, with Alpine and Red Bull consistently proving faster across the race stints, highlighting the Italian team's challenge in adapting to the changing conditions at the Interlagos circuit. Among the many insights offered by the chaotic Brazilian Grand Prix, the issue of wet weather tires was undeniably critical. The race at Interlagos took place under shifting weather conditions, impacted by the varying intensity of rain and the recent resurfacing of the entire São Paulo circuit. Pirelli's intermediate compounds once again proved to be an excellent choice on wet and damp tracks. However, at certain points, the rain intensity surpassed the working range of the green-banded tires. Visa Cash App drivers tried to gain an advantage by switching to extreme wet tires, which were certainly the best option before the race was neutralized following Colapinto's heavy crash under the safety car. For a while now, when rain falls heavily, teams avoid using the full wet tires, waiting for conditions to improve, knowing that poor visibility often leads race control to deploy Bernd Maylander's safety car rather than suspending the race. This naturally raises the question, what purpose do full wet tires serve? According to current thinking, the FIA rightly prioritizes driver safety, sometimes even excessively so. F1 teams, in turn, hardly consider blue-banded tires as they are effective only when the track is nearly flooded. The performance gap between intermediate and extreme wet tires is too significant when rain intensity drops. While the FIA aims to protect driver safety, F1 teams focus on performance, keeping their drivers on less suitable tires. Last Sunday, before the safety car was deployed, drivers were lapping close to 2 minutes per lap. Nonetheless, all the drivers in the top 10, aside from Yuki Tsunoda, were running on intermediates. At a time when F1 embraces economic and environmental sustainability, it seems almost outdated to continue investing in research, development, and production of a tire that is rarely used by teams. Moreover, full wet tires pose visibility issues due to the sheer amount of water they displace. It's important to note that an F1 car on full wets at 300 kilometers per hour can expel 340 liters of water per second. This impressive volume of water is channeled away by the tread to prevent aquaplaning. However, this also creates a water plume that drastically reduces visibility for drivers following close behind. The FIA is working to address this issue by adopting kits aimed at reducing tire spray. So far, the tests have not produced the desired results, partly because the current generation of ground effect cars raises a significant amount of mist in the central part of the vehicle, where the Venturi tunnels are located. Meanwhile, Pirelli continues to develop wet tires. The tire supplier will use the break following the exhausting triple header to test new wet weather tires on November 13th and 14th at the Magny-Cours track in France, aiming to gather as much data as possible for next season's wet weather prototypes. It's worth noting that for some time now, various drivers have raised concerns about Pirelli's current offerings, yet at the same time, many are reluctant to participate in the tire development tests the Italian company organizes so diligently.